The county courtroom smelled of lemon floor wax and stale coffee. Dust motes drifted in the sharp shafts of morning light cutting through the tall arched windows. Judge Carter peered over his wire-rimmed reading glasses, his wooden gavel resting heavy on the scarred mahogany block. "Mrs. Hayes," he began, the syllables echoing across the cavernous room. "Your own parents have testified under oath that you are a danger to your children. Do you have anything to say?" I sat at the defense table. My hands rested flat on the faux wood laminate surface. Beneath my right palm sat a 3-inch crimson binder. Its edges were sharp, the plastic casing pristine. I traced the bottom corner with my thumb. Panic is a predictable script, one the court expected me to read. They wanted tears. They wanted a fractured, hysterical mother pleading for mercy. Instead, a deep, subterranean calm anchored my chest. It was a cold precision born from the ashes of the worst week of my life. Before I tell you how I dismantled their carefully constructed lies, do me a favor. If you've ever had a family member stab you in the back, drop your age and where you're listening from in the comments. I'd love to know I'm not the only one. Oh, and hit that subscribe button for Amanda Told Stories so you don't miss the rest of this train wreck. Now, to understand how I burned their narrative to the ground, you have to go back exactly 7 days. 7 days earlier, the Nebraska wind howled across the plains, rattling the loose window panes of my farmhouse. The silence inside hung heavier than the winter draft. It had been barely 48 hours since we lowered 12-year-old Leo into the frozen earth. The house still held the faint, lingering scent of his antiseptic soaps and the metallic tang of his oxygen tanks. I stood in the kitchen, staring at a mug of cold tea, unable to remember when I poured it. Then a sharp rap struck the front door. The sudden noise startled me. Out here, surrounded by miles of dormant cornfields and frozen irrigation lines, unannounced visitors were rare. I pulled my knitted sweater tight across my collarbones and walked into the foyer. Through the frosted glass panes, 2 familiar silhouettes stood on the porch. I turned the brass knob and pulled the heavy door open. Joan and Calvin stood on the welcome mat. I hadn't laid eyes on my parents in 12 months, not since the afternoon they stood in this very room and refused to watch 6-year-old Toby and Mia so I could sleep in a plastic chair next to Leo's hospital bed. My mother did not offer open arms. She did not murmur condolences. Instead, she offered a practiced, tight-lipped smile reserved for church charity drives. She wore a pristine slate gray wool coat. It looked tailored, perhaps a cashmere blend, its fabric unblemished by farm dust or financial strain. It was an astonishingly expensive garment for a woman who spent the previous decade complaining about the rising cost of winter propane. Beside her, my father didn't bother with pleasantries. Calvin thrust a thick manila envelope toward my chest. The stiff paper struck my ribs. "We're here for the twins," he stated, his voice flat and transactional. I looked down. The bold, capitalized letters on the top sheet read, "Emergency, ex parte, petition for temporary custody." Below that, in stark black ink, lay the formal assertion that I was an unfit guardian, destabilized by grief, incapable of providing a safe environment. They hadn't come to mourn their grandson. They had come to harvest the spares. I looked from the legal paperwork to my mother's polished boots, then up to my father's impassive jaw. The air in my lungs turned to ice. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't beg or demand explanations. I stepped back, easing the oak door shut. The latch clicked. I threw the deadbolt, the metal sliding home with a definitive snap. Seconds later, Calvin's fists pounded against the wood, a rhythmic drumming that vibrated through the empty hallway. The siege had begun. The heavy thud of Calvin's fists against the oak door vibrated through the floorboards, traveling straight up through the soles of my shoes. I stood perfectly still in the dim foyer. The deadbolt held firm. Outside, the Nebraska winter bit at the frosted glass, but the chill inside my veins felt far colder. As I stared at the brass lock keeping my parents at bay, the sound of the pounding began to blur, morphing into another rhythmic, hollow noise from exactly 6 months ago. The steady, mechanical hiss of a hospital ventilator. Half a year earlier, the walls closing in on me were painted a sterile pediatric pastel. Leo lay asleep in the narrow hospital bed, his skin pale against the institutional sheets. The room smelled of sharp bleach and stale cafeteria soup. On my lap sat a stack of envelopes, their edges curled from how many times I had thumbed through them. Final notices, orange warning labels, the relentless crushing mathematics of keeping a child alive. The pediatric oncology ward did not run on hope. It ran on billing codes. My reserves were gone. I had drained my savings, maxed out every line of credit, and spent my nights sleeping in a stiff vinyl chair so I wouldn't miss a single consultation. Meanwhile, Toby and Mia, only 6 years old, were being shuttled between exhausted neighbors. I needed a reprieve. Just 1 month of stability for the twins, so I could focus entirely on Leo's declining numbers. I stepped into the echoing hospital corridor, leaning my forehead against the cold cinder block wall, and dialed the one person who shared half the DNA of those children. Derek, my ex-husband. The phone rang 4 times before he answered. I could hear the low rumble of a diesel engine and the static of a dispatcher radio in his background. I swallowed my pride, a jagged pill that scraped the back of my throat, and laid out the reality. I begged him to take Toby and Mia for 30 days. I explained the hospital schedule, the exhaustion, the terrifying reality of Leo's failing lungs. Derek did not offer a comforting word. He let out a long, loud sigh, the kind a frustrated boss gives an underperforming employee. "You are just a struggling writer, Gretchen," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Handle it." "I have a real career. I cannot pause my operations because you failed to manage your time." The line went dead. The dial tone hummed in my ear, a flat, continuous sound that mirrored the flat line of our former marriage. The irony of his insult burned deep in my chest. A struggling writer. Derek liked to reduce my profession to something quaint, picturing me typing bad poetry at a coffee shop. He intentionally ignored the reality of my work. I was a technical writer, but my specialty was agricultural logistics and federal grants compliance. I authored the dense, labyrinthine manuals that dictated how subsidies flowed through the Great Plains. I tracked grain yields, beef export tariffs, and complex supply chain algorithms. I organized chaos into profitable data for a living. In fact, I had organized his chaos. Another memory surfaced unbidden, layering itself over the hospital corridor. 5 years ago, our dining room table buried under a snowdrift of wrinkled invoices, unpaid toll fees, and failing freight manifests. Derek had paced the kitchen, a glass of cheap bourbon in his hand, terrified he was going to lose his trucking company. He knew how to drive a rig, but he had no idea how to run a business. I stayed up until 3 a.m. for 6 consecutive weeks. I color-coded his spreadsheets. I audited his fuel logs. I found the routing inefficiencies that were bleeding his margins dry and restructured his entire dispatch system. I saved his fleet from bankruptcy without asking for a dime or a sliver of equity. And when the new ledgers were balanced, Derek would sit at the head of the table, his chest puffed out, ready to sign the finalized contracts. He always used a specific pen. It was a heavy, custom-ordered fountain pen with a silver barrel. He loved the theatricality of it. He loved uncapping it and watching the nib glide across the paper. The ink was a distinct, vibrant sapphire blue. It was a shade you could not find in a standard ballpoint, a rich cobalt that pooled slightly at the curves of his signature. He adored that pen because it made him feel important. It made him feel like the savior of his own story, conveniently forgetting who had actually done the math. The sudden roar of a heavy engine outside my farmhouse snapped me back to the present. The pounding on my front door had ceased. I took a slow breath, stepping closer to the foyer window. I pulled the edge of the curtain back just a fraction of an inch. A heavy-duty black dually pickup truck rolled up the gravel driveway, its tires crunching loud over the frozen earth. It parked at a harsh angle directly behind my parents' sedan, blocking them in. The driver's door swung open. Derek stepped out into the bitter Nebraska cold. He wore a tailored leather jacket, his posture stiff and deliberate. He walked toward the porch. Calvin turned to greet him. Joan reached out and patted Derek's arm. I stared through the glass, my heart slowing down to a deliberate, steady rhythm. Joan and Calvin despised Derek. During the divorce, my mother had called him every vile name in the dictionary. Yet here they were, standing shoulder to shoulder on my frost-covered lawn. My mother offered him a warm, conspiratorial nod. They had formed a unified front. The pieces of the puzzle began to click together in my mind, forming a terrifying, crystal-clear picture. This was not a spontaneous visit. This was a choreographed ambush. They had timed this strike perfectly. They waited exactly 1 week after the funeral. They waited until the casseroles stopped arriving, until the neighbors stopped checking in, until they assumed the grief had hollowed me out into a fragile, compliant shell. They assumed I would be too shattered to fight back, too exhausted to read the fine print of that custody petition, too broken to question why my estranged ex-husband and my estranged parents were suddenly working as a team. They expected a victim. They expected a weeping, unstable woman who would collapse on the foyer rug and hand over her remaining children. I dropped to the edge of the curtain. The fabric settled back into place, plunging the hallway into dim shadows. I was not broken. I was recalibrated. The hot, blinding sting of betrayal evaporated, leaving behind a cold, structural clarity. If Derek and my parents were collaborating, there was a transaction taking place. People like Derek did not waste time on family drama unless there was a tangible, profitable return on investment. People like my mother did not buy high-end wool coats while claiming to be worried about a grieving daughter. There was a hidden ledger connecting them. I turned my back on the locked front door. I did not care how long they stood in the freezing wind. I walked down the long, silent hallway, passing the closed door of Leo's bedroom. I did not let my eyes linger on the wood. I could not afford to mourn right now. I had 2 surviving children sleeping upstairs, and a pack of wolves waiting on the porch. I entered my home office. The room was sparse, dominated by a large oak desk and dual monitors. I sat in the ergonomic chair. I reached down and pressed the power button on the computer tower. The cooling fans whirred to life, a low, comforting hum in the quiet house. The screens flickered, casting a sharp blue light across my face. I was not a struggling writer. I was an auditor, and it was time to audit my own life. The glow of my dual monitors pushed back the encroaching shadows of the farmhouse office, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the sterile light. I had spent my entire professional life auditing systems tracking subsidies and finding the flaws in complex logistical networks. Now the system I needed to dismantle was my own family. The central question hammered against the inside of my skull. Why now? Why come for Toby and Mia exactly 1 week after Leo's funeral? They hadn't wanted the twins when I was desperate, when I was begging for a reprieve so I could stay at the hospital. They had guarded their comfortable, unburdened lives fiercely. So what had changed? Or more accurately, What were they trying to protect? I opened a new incognito browser window. I didn't start with legal databases or county tax records. I started where the true currency of a small Nebraska agricultural community is traded: the local Facebook groups, the church message boards, the community council forums. I typed my own name into the search bars, then my parents' names, then Leo's. It took less than 15 minutes for the first major piece of their fraudulent architecture to reveal itself. A link populated on a Neighborhood Watch page directing to a crowdfunding site. I clicked it. The page loaded slowly, the progress bar inching across the top of the screen before the image fully resolved. My breath caught in my throat. It was a photograph of Leo. He was wearing his favorite baseball cap, the one that hid the hair loss from the first round of chemotherapy. He was smiling, a wide, gap-toothed grin that reached all the way to his bright hazel eyes. It was a private photo, one I had posted to my own restricted social media page over a year ago. The title of the campaign, rendered in bold, urgent letters, read, "Save Our Grandson Leo, a Community Plea." The organizer was listed as Joan Hayes, my mother. I scrolled down the page, my eyes tracking the numbers with the cold, detached precision of a seasoned auditor. The goal had been set at $50,000. The progress bar showed they had blasted past it, raising a staggering $85,420. The donor list read like a directory of the surrounding 3 counties. Local cattle ranchers, grain cooperative managers, small business owners, and families from our congregation had poured their hard-earned money into this digital bucket. There were donations of $50 from retired school teachers and $500 anonymous drops that I knew came from the wealthier freight operators. $85,000. Not a single cent of that money had ever reached my bank account. Not one dime had gone toward Leo's deductibles, his copays, his specialized transportation, or the exorbitant cost of the experimental treatments we had tried near the end. I had drained my retirement savings. I had remortgaged the farmhouse. I had lived on peanut butter and hospital cafeteria crackers for a year, drowning in financial terror while my mother sat on a small fortune raised in my dying son's name. The immediate visceral question struck me. How had no one in this tight-knit, gossipy town ever mentioned it to me? How had no one at the grocery store or the pharmacy asked how the funds were helping? I found the answer buried in the campaign's update section. Joan had posted regular, heart-wrenching missives. She detailed Leo's declining health with sickening poetic flair. But it was the final paragraph of her most recent update, posted 6 months ago, that explained the silence. "We are so incredibly grateful for your overwhelming generosity," Joan had written. "However, I must ask a difficult favor of our wonderful community. Gretchen is an incredibly proud woman, and the grief is making her deeply sensitive, almost volatile regarding finances. She refuses to accept charity directly and becomes very upset if it is brought up. Please, out of respect for her fragile state, do not mention this campaign to her. Direct all questions, prayers, and continued support through Calvin and me. We are ensuring every penny goes to Leo's care without adding to Gretchen's emotional burden." She had weaponized my pride and my grief to isolate me. She had erected a social firewall around my life, ensuring that the community's goodwill was funneled directly into her own pockets, and that their well-meaning silence protected her theft. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, the leather creaking slightly in the quiet room. My hands were trembling, but not from sorrow. It was the physical manifestation of adrenaline, the sharp, electric current of realizing you are not just a victim of circumstance, but the target of a predator. I reached into the deep pocket of my cardigan. My fingers closed around a small, heavy object. I pulled it out and set it gently on the oak desk, right next to the glowing keyboard. It was a die-cast metal toy, a miniature freight truck, specifically a flatbed hauler. It had been Leo's favorite toy since he was 4 years old. He used to push it across the linoleum kitchen floor for hours, providing his own sound effects, imagining he was moving mountains of supplies across the plains. The metal was chipped along the edges, the bright red paint faded from years of tight, loving grips. It symbolized the pure, uncorrupted memory of my son. It represented a child's innocent view of the world, where heavy machinery was just a tool for building things up. It stood in stark, sickening contrast to the corrupt, failing, real-world freight trucks that Derek operated, and the monstrous greed that my mother had built her campaign upon. Holding that small, chipped toy in my palm, I felt the final fragments of my paralyzing grief harden into something indestructible. I turned back to the monitors. I did not close the crowdfunding page. I opened my printing software. I began to capture every single pixel of that campaign. I printed the initial description. The donor lists the timestamps of every update and the digital withdrawal receipts that the platform publicly logged. The laser printer in the corner of my office whirred to life, spitting out warm, crisp pages of evidence. I reached for the heavy crimson binder I kept on the lower shelf, the one I used for the most complex federal grant audits. I snapped the metal rings open. I began sliding the printed pages into clear plastic protectors, snapping them into place. The first tab of the binder was now populated. The true nature of their emergency custody petition was no longer a mystery. It wasn't about Toby and Mia. It wasn't about my mental fitness. It was a cover-up. If my parents could convince a judge that I was unstable, unhinged by grief, and unfit to care for my surviving children, they would accomplish 2 things. First, they would secure the twins, likely aiming for state-funded kinship foster stipends to add to their stolen wealth. Second, and more importantly, they would preemptively discredit me. If a court declared me mentally unfit, any accusations I made about stolen charity money would be dismissed as the paranoid ravings of a broken, grieving mother. They were trying to silence the only witness to their grift, before the witness even knew a crime had been committed. But their plan had a fatal flaw. They assumed they were dealing with the exhausted, compliant daughter they had known for 30 years. They didn't realize they were dealing with an auditor who had just found the first discrepancy in the ledger. I snapped the red binder shut. The sharp crack echoed in the quiet office. The GoFundMe explained my parents' motive. It explained the expensive new wool coat. But it did not explain Derek. Why was my ex-husband a man who had explicitly told me he was too busy to take his own children, suddenly standing on my porch, aligning himself with the in-laws who despised him? Derek did not do favors. Derek did not act out of paternal instinct. Derek acted out of financial self-preservation. I moved my mouse to open a new tab. It was time to look into the generational wealth of the Hayes family and the complex bureaucratic machinery of agricultural trusts. I cracked my knuckles, the sound sharp and definitive. The audit was just beginning. The first section of my crimson binder held the anatomy of my mother's deception. The plastic sleeves felt thick, heavy with the weight of her stolen charity hoard. But Joan and Calvin represented only 2 sides of this predatory triangle. I shifted my gaze to the secondary monitor on my desk. It was time to examine the third. Derek, my ex-husband, standing on my frost-covered porch, alongside the former in-laws who openly despised him, defied every emotional boundary our family ever possessed. They had spent the better part of a decade trading thinly veiled insults at Thanksgiving dinners. Their sudden, seamless alliance required a potent catalyst. In my experience auditing corporate supply chains when sworn enemies link arms, the motive is never sentimental. The motive is always capital. I needed to understand the exact architecture of Derek's desperation. During our marriage, he operated under a veneer of invincible pride. He wore tailored leather jackets, drove a heavy-duty pickup he rarely used for actual hauling, and spoke in the clipped, urgent cadence of a man moving vast fortunes across the Great Plains. He projected endless success. But I remembered the frantic, sweaty pacing in our kitchen at 3 a.m. I remembered balancing ledgers that bled red ink. Derek was a man perpetually chasing his own inflated shadow. I opened a secure, encrypted drive where I stored my personal legal archives. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, the sharp clacking echoing in the silent farmhouse. I pulled up our finalized divorce decree, bypassing the custody arrangements and zeroing in on the asset division and financial disclosures. Then I cross-referenced those old filings with the Nebraska Secretary of State's corporate database. I typed in the name of his freight company. The loading icon spun, reflecting a pale blue circle in my eyes. As the dense legal documents populated the screen, a distinct, powerful advantage settled over me. Derek always dismissed my career. He viewed my hours spent drafting technical manuals as glorified typing. He failed to comprehend the true nature of my expertise. 3 years prior, the State Agricultural Department contracted a freelance firm to overhaul and rewrite their public compliance guidelines for generational land transfers and federal subsidy distributions. I was the lead author on that project. For 9 months, I lived inside the bureaucratic labyrinth of state farming statutes. I translated dense, impenetrable legislative text into operational protocols. I mapped the exact legal pathways dictating how money flowed from the government down to the soil. I knew the regulations. I knew the exemptions. And most importantly, I knew the hidden loopholes. I scrolled through the corporate filings, tracing the lineage of the Hayes family assets. Derek's father, Elias, had been a pragmatic, hardened Nebraska corn farmer. Elias built a highly profitable operation from the ground up. He also possessed a sharp, unforgiving intuition regarding his son. Elias knew Derek lacked the discipline for agricultural management, recognizing his son's reckless ambition to become a logistics mogul would eventually consume their legacy. To protect the family wealth, Elias locked the bulk of the agricultural land and its accompanying federal subsidies into a generational farming trust before he passed away. I pulled the public summary of that specific trust. My eyes scanned the dense paragraphs hunting for the specific bypass clauses I had written manuals about for the state. I found the trigger hidden in Section 4. The trust was designed to skip Derek's direct control, earmarking the liquid disbursements for the grandchildren. During Leo's life, the trust remained in a holding pattern, accumulating interest and federal payouts, awaiting the day the eldest heir came of age. But Leo was gone. The legal text outlined the contingency protocol with cold, bureaucratic efficiency. In the event of a beneficiary's passing, the proportional shares automatically bypassed the deceased and reallocated to the surviving siblings. Toby and Mia were now the sole heirs to the Elias Hayes Agricultural Trust. My heart thudded against my ribs as I isolated the payout structure. The federal subsidies attached to those specific parcels of land generated a liquid disbursement of roughly $4,000 every single month. $48,000 a year in untouchable, tax-advantaged capital. There was only one catch. Because Toby and Mia were minors, the funds required an administrative proxy. Whoever held primary physical and legal custody of those children controlled the bank accounts. Whoever controlled the children controlled the cash flow. I had the motive. Now I needed to prove the urgency. Why did Derek need that $4,000 a month right now? Why coordinate an ambush mere days after a funeral? I opened a new browser tab and navigated to the public vendor portal used by state logistics contractors. It was a centralized hub where freight operators bidded on government transport jobs and managed their compliance statuses. Accessing the back end required a registered contractor login. Derek fancied himself a titan of industry, a man who outsmarted the system at every turn. Yet his approach to basic cybersecurity remained shockingly arrogant and predictable. For a decade, he used the exact same sequence for every digital lock in his life. The name of his high school mascot, followed by his birth year. I typed the sequence into the credential fields. The screen paused, authenticating the request. A second later, the dashboard unlocked. I was inside his operational nervous system. The screen did not display a thriving logistics empire. It displayed a digital bloodbath. My eyes darted across the dashboard, cataloging the destruction. I navigated to the public notices and compliance warning section. I began downloading the PDFs one by one, the files stacking up in my download folder like a deck of damning cards. There were active lien notices from 2 different regional banks. Creditors were moving to seize his fleet of flatbed trailers. I found an urgent notice from his primary commercial diesel supplier, indicating his fuel credit lines had been permanently severed due to non-payment. 3 major shipping contracts had been voided in the past 45 days for failure to deliver. Derek's business was not just struggling, it was actively collapsing. He was weeks, perhaps days away from total bankruptcy and the auction block. I leaned back, staring at the cascading red warnings on the screen. The entire sinister bargain crystallized in the quiet space of my office. Joan and Calvin needed me out of the picture to keep their stolen charity hoard a secret. By securing custody of the twins, my parents would also qualify for state-funded kinship foster stipends, adding another stream of untraceable revenue to their fraudulent empire. Derek needed me out of the picture to claim the administrative rights to his father's farming trust. That $4,000 a month was not a college fund for his surviving children. It was a lifeline. It was the exact amount of liquid capital he needed to appease his most aggressive creditors, keep his remaining trucks on the road, and stave off the impending repossession of his livelihood. This was not a tragic family dispute born from grief and misunderstanding. This was a calculated, hostile, corporate takeover. My ex-husband and my parents had merged their corrupt interests, forming a syndicate of desperation. My children were not family members to them. Toby and Mia were the primary assets in a high-stakes liquidation. I printed the vendor dashboard logs. I printed the bank lien notices. I printed the trust bypass clauses. The laser printer worked tirelessly, spitting out the warm pages that would become the second section of my crimson binder. I snapped the protective plastic sleeves into place, sealing Derek's financial ruin alongside my mother's moral bankruptcy. The digital fortress was fully constructed. I had the paper trail. I had the irrefutable proof of their collusion. But the glow of the monitors could not feed my children. I glanced at the digital clock in the corner of the screen. It was early morning. The sun had crested the horizon, casting a pale, freezing light across the frost-covered cornfields outside my window. The twins would be waking up soon. I walked into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator door. The shelves were practically barren. A carton of milk past its date, a few wrinkled apples, and a half-empty jar of jelly. During the final weeks of Leo's decline, grocery shopping had fallen entirely off my radar. I needed to feed my surviving children. I had to leave the protective sanctuary of my farmhouse. I had to step out into a town where my mother had spent the last 12 months meticulously poisoning the soil against me. I zipped up my winter coat, feeling the heavy chill of the impending confrontation. The paperwork was safe on my desk, but the real war was waiting for me in the aisles of the local market. The freezing Nebraska wind sliced across my cheeks as I stepped off the farmhouse porch. My boots crunched over the brittle, frozen grass. Surviving required calories, and my kitchen cabinets held nothing but echoes and dust. Toby and Mia needed routine. They needed fresh milk peanut butter and the brightly colored cereal boxes that offered a fleeting illusion of normalcy. I could not feed my remaining children with printouts of vendor dashboards or state subsidy statutes. I had to leave my sanctuary. I had to face the town. I turned the ignition key in my old sedan. The engine turned over with a sluggish groan before catching, blowing a plume of white exhaust into the frigid morning air. Driving toward the town center, I watched the dormant cornfields roll past my window in a blur of pale gold and gray. This community operated on a localized, intricate network of shared histories and whispered gossip. Information flowed faster than the nearby river, usually exchanged over church pews or across the tops of grain silos. By now, the entire county likely knew about the emergency custody petition. I pulled into the parking lot of Henderson Grocery. The asphalt was crowded with mud-splattered pickup trucks and sensible family sedans. I pulled my knit scarf up over my chin, a feeble shield against the stares I knew were waiting inside. The automatic glass doors slid open with a mechanical hiss, welcoming me into a sensory assault of humming fluorescent lights, squeaking shopping cart wheels, and the sharp scent of citrus floor cleaner. I grabbed a wire basket. My strategy was pure efficiency. Get in, navigate the perimeter, secure the necessities, and get out. I made it through the produce section without incident. I selected a bunch of bananas and a bag of crisp red apples. I turned down aisle 4 to grab a loaf of wheat bread. That was when the trap sprang closed. Gretchen. Oh, my poor Gretchen. The voice pitched perfectly to carry over the low hum of the refrigeration units. I froze my fingers gripping the plastic bread wrapper. I turned, slowly. Joan stood at the end of the aisle. She wore the same slate-gray cashmere coat from the day she pounded on my door, paired with pristine leather gloves. She did not hunt alone. Flanking her were two women I recognized instantly: Patricia, the president of the Community Outreach Council, and Susan, the head treasurer for the local parish. These were women who directed the social currents of our town. Women who decided whose tragedies were worthy of casseroles and whose failures were meant for quiet shun. Joan rushed forward, her eyes pooled with instantaneous glistening tears. She extended her arms, lunging for a physical embrace. I stepped backward, my spine colliding with the metal edge of the shelving unit. I raised my wire basket, creating a physical barrier between my chest and her outstretched hands. Joan stopped, letting her arms fall to her sides in a display of profound manufactured rejection. A single tear escaped her eyelid, tracing a pristine path down her powdered cheek. She turned her face just enough so Patricia and Susan could register her maternal sorrow. "We are just so worried about you, sweetheart," Joan said, her voice wavering with practiced vulnerability. "You look so thin, so exhausted. Please, Gretchen, stop fighting us. Let us take the kids so you can heal. You need a facility. You need rest." The audacity of her performance sent a physical shockwave through my nervous system. She was standing in the middle of a grocery store, flanked by the town's moral arbiters, painting me as a fractured, unstable risk to my own offspring. She weaponized my grief, twisting the darkest agony of my life into a public spectacle designed to secure her fraudulent empire. Patricia stepped forward, her expression fixed in a mask of agonizing pity. She tilted her head, offering a soft, patronizing sigh. "Gretchen, honey," Patricia murmured, her tone dripping with Midwestern condescension. "Your mother is heartbroken. We all are. Losing Leo, it is a burden no woman should carry alone. But dragging Toby and Mia through a nasty court battle, that will only damage those precious twins further. A judge will see how broken you are right now. Give them to your parents. Do the selfless thing." Susan nodded in solemn agreement, clutching her purse with both hands. "We are praying for your mind to find peace, Gretchen. Don't let your stubborn pride hurt those surviving babies." My internal monologue roared. A blistering white-hot fury clawed at my throat. I wanted to drop the wire basket. I wanted to scream until the fluorescent bulbs shattered. I wanted to drag Joan to the center of the store, empty the contents of my crimson binder onto the linoleum floor, and force Patricia and Susan to read the donation logs. I wanted to demand where the $85,000 went. I wanted to expose the sick, twisted corporate takeover my mother and my ex-husband had orchestrated over the grave of my firstborn son. But I knew the rules of the audit. If I raised my voice, I lost. If I wept, if I pointed fingers, if I allowed a single syllable of rage to escape my lips, I would hand them the exact victory they sought. An emotional outburst would cement their narrative. It would provide Patricia and Susan with the perfect anecdote to share at the next council meeting. Gretchen became hysterical in aisle 4. Joan was right. She is entirely unhinged. I swallowed the fire burning in my esophagus. I locked my facial muscles into a mask of impenetrable ice. I did not offer a defense. I did not engage with the bait. I turned my back on the three of them. I walked toward the checkout lanes with deliberate, measured steps. My pulse hammered a frantic rhythm in my ears, but my posture remained rigid and flawless. I approached the nearest register. The teenage cashier behind the counter stood frozen, her eyes wide, clearly having witnessed the entire theatrical display. Her hands trembled slightly as she took the apples, the bread, and the milk from my wire basket. Joan followed me. She stood mere inches behind my shoulder, determined to drag the confrontation to the finish line. "Gretchen, please," Joan sobbed, loud enough for the neighboring cashier to hear. "Do not push your family away. We are doing this out of love." The teenage cashier scanned my items. The scanner beeped a sharp, repetitive sound cutting through Joan's theatrical weeping. I pulled a $20 bill from my wallet and handed it to the girl. She took the cash, returning my change in a long, curling strip of thermal paper. I stared at the receipt printer on the counter. The mechanical gears whirred, pressing black ink into the crisp white paper. The visual grounded me. It reminded me of a fundamental truth I had learned years ago while drafting compliance manuals. Emotions evaporate, tears dry, gossip twists and fades into the ether. But ink is permanent. A paper trail does not care about public opinion. A ledger does not require a sympathetic audience. The black ink printed on the bank statement sitting on my home desk held more power than 1,000 fake tears shed in a grocery store aisle. I took the receipt from the cashier and folded it, neatly sliding it into my coat pocket. I picked up my plastic grocery bags. I turned to face my mother. Joan stopped sobbing. She held her breath, waiting for the explosion, waiting for the hysterical reaction she could package and deliver to the family court judge. I looked deep into her eyes. I stripped away the role of the grieving daughter. I stripped away the role of the struggling ex-wife. I offered her nothing but the cold, calculating gaze of an auditor who has already found the missing funds. I did not blink. I stared into her pupils until her confident posture faltered, until a flicker of genuine unsettled fear passed behind her practiced sorrow. I did not utter a single word. I walked past her in total, deafening silence. The automatic glass doors parted, and I stepped out into the freezing Nebraska morning, leaving the town to believe Joan had won the skirmish, knowing full well I was preparing to win the war. I loaded the groceries into the trunk of my sedan. As I slammed the trunk lid shut, my eyes caught a glimpse of a glossy local real estate magazine, discarded in a nearby shopping cart. The cover featured a sprawling plot of commercial farming acreage for sale. My mind snapped back to the $85,000. Joan had purchased that slate gray wool coat, but a luxury garment did not account for a fortune. People driven by profound greed rarely let large sums of cash sit idle in checking accounts. They invest. They convert liquid assets into tangible property. If Joan had funneled the stolen charity funds into something permanent, there would be a public record of the transaction, a property deed, a newly formed corporate entity, a fresh signature on a county tax document. I climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine roared to life, matching the newfound urgency pumping through my veins. The grocery store ambush had intended to break my spirit, but it had only sharpened my focus. I put the car in drive and accelerated toward the farmhouse. I needed to dig into the county property logs. It was time to find out exactly what my mother bought with the price of my son's life. The drive back from Henderson Grocery felt like navigating a frozen tunnel. My knuckles gripped the steering wheel rigid and white against the dark synthetic leather. I kept my eyes locked on the gray ribbon of asphalt stretching between the dormant cornfields, refusing to let my mind replay the theatrical display Joan had orchestrated in aisle 4. Surviving the town's pity required a hardened exterior, but the adrenaline from that encounter still coursed through my veins, demanding an outlet. I parked the sedan near the porch and carried the plastic grocery bags inside. The thin handles dug into my numb fingers, a sharp, grounding pain. I unpacked the milk, the bread, and the apples with mechanical precision. Toby and Mia were upstairs in their shared bedroom, constructing elaborate towers out of wooden blocks, insulated, for now, from the gathering storm. I poured a glass of cold tap water, drank it in one long swallow, and walked straight back into my home office. The dual monitors waited, casting a pale, sterile glow across the oak desk. My brief glance at that discarded real estate magazine outside the market had ignited a very specific theory. People driven by profound, unchecked greed rarely allowed large sums of liquid cash to sit idle in standard checking accounts. They sought returns. They converted digital numbers into tangible assets. I settled into my ergonomic chair and brought up the county assessor's digital database. Finding hidden real estate in Nebraska required navigating a dense labyrinth of corporate shielding, but my career had taught me exactly how to read between the bureaucratic lines. Individuals attempting to conceal sudden wealth avoided purchasing acreage under their personal names. They formed holding companies masking their identities behind registered agents and generic business titles. I bypassed the standard name search and pulled the localized commercial registration logs for the past 12 months, cross-referencing the results with my parents' physical residential address. The system processed the query, a small loading icon spinning in the center of the screen. A single hit populated the dashboard. A newly formed entity titled Golden Harvest Holdings, LLC. The designated registered agent was Calvin Hayes. I clicked on the corporate charter, my pulse drumming a steady, hollow beat against my eardrums. Golden Harvest Holdings had recently acquired a 20-acre parcel of prime commercial farming land situated just outside the county line, an area slated for heavy agricultural development. I navigated to the deed registry and pulled the public transaction record. The purchase price stared back at me in stark black font. $85,000, flat. It was a cash transaction. No mortgage recorded, no lien holders listed, just a straight, unencumbered transfer of wealth. My eyes darted to the top right corner of the digital document, searching for the official filing timestamp. October 14th. I reached for the crimson portfolio resting on the edge of my desk. I flipped open the heavy cover, turning past my notes on Derek's failing freight logistics landing on the printed logs from the crowdfunding campaign. I traced my index finger down the column of digital withdrawals, scanning the dates. On October 14th, a single lump sum transfer was initiated by the campaign organizer, draining the charity account down to zero. The dates were a flawless, undeniable match. A wave of physical revulsion washed over me so potent I had to grip the edge of the desk to keep the room from spinning. Joan and Calvin had not merely stolen money. They had commodified their own grandson's terminal illness. Every time my mother posted a tearful, agonizing update about Leo's declining white blood cell count, she was essentially marketing a real estate investment. They had traded my dying son's face for 20 acres of fertile Nebraska soil. The betrayal transcended standard financial theft. It was a ghoulish, calculated transaction. While I was rationing cafeteria crackers and praying for a medical miracle in a sterile hospital ward, my parents were browsing property listings and negotiating closing costs with stolen goodwill. The fire burning in my chest demanded an immediate, explosive reaction. A weaker version of myself would have grabbed the phone, dialed my mother's number, and screamed until my vocal cords shredded. But the grocery store ambush had taught me a vital lesson regarding my enemies. Joan fed on dramatic conflict, using it to cast herself as the eternal victim. Derek thrived on crushing direct opposition. If I confronted them with this evidence right now, they would recognize the lethal nature of the threat. They would hire expensive defense attorneys, obscure the remaining assets, and drastically alter their strategy for the upcoming custody dispute. I needed them complacent. I needed them to walk into that future courtroom blinded by their own arrogance. To achieve that level of vulnerability, I had to give them exactly what they craved. I had to hand them the illusion of total victory. I picked up my smartphone. The screen illuminated, casting a harsh light across my face. I opened a new text message thread addressed to Joan. My thumbs hovered over the digital keyboard. Drafting this specific message required swallowing every ounce of pride I possessed. I had to channel the desperate, fractured woman they believed me to be. I had to become the struggling writer Derek despised. I typed slowly, ensuring the tone was sufficiently pathetic and devoid of any fight. I do not have the funds to fight you and Derek. My power is about to be shut off. I am so tired. Please just let me see Toby and Mia on the holidays. I stared at the blinking cursor at the end of the text. Hitting send on those sentences felt like swallowing jagged glass. It was a profound submission, a digital white flag waving in the face of monsters. But it was also the ultimate snare. I pressed send. The message vanished in a brief swoosh, traveling through the cellular towers, delivering my fake surrender directly into my mother's hands. I set the phone face down on the desk. Now the waiting began. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The screen remained dark. Joan did not reply. She did not offer a magnanimous acceptance of my defeat, nor did she gloat via text. Her silence was the most predictable and reassuring outcome. In her mind, acknowledging my message would require engaging with my humanity, and she had long since categorized me as a mere obstacle to be cleared from her path. But I knew exactly how that text message was circulating through their unified front. Joan would immediately screenshot my words and forward them to Derek's phone. Calvin would nod in grim satisfaction from his recliner. They would view my surrender as the natural, inevitable culmination of their brilliant, coordinated pressure campaign. I could picture Derek sitting in his dispatch office, kicking his boots up on his desk, laughing at my admission of financial ruin. I could envision Joan sipping tea in her pristine kitchen, mentally picking out new fencing for her commercial farmland. They would stop reviewing their legal strategy. They would cancel any preparatory sessions with their counsel. Why waste billable hours preparing for a war the opposing side had already formally conceded? They would assume the upcoming court date was nothing more than a bureaucratic formality, a simple rubber stamp on their hostile takeover. They were entirely unaware of the heavy crimson portfolio resting beside my keyboard. They had no idea that their perceived victory lap was actually a blind march toward a meticulously constructed legal trap. I spent the remainder of the afternoon finalizing the audit. I cross-referenced the LLC charter with the state tax code, highlighting the specific statutes they had violated regarding the misappropriation of charitable funds and wire fraud. I pulled Derek's vendor logs one last time, ensuring I had the most updated record of his imminent bankruptcy and severed credit lines. Every single document was categorized, labeled with adhesive tabs, and secured within the plastic sleeves. The snare was set. The bait had been swallowed whole. But the quiet isolation of my farmhouse was about to be shattered once again. The legal machinery they had set in motion days ago was still grinding inexorably toward my doorstep. As the winter sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, dark shadows across the frozen cornfields, the heavy crunch of tires sounded on the gravel driveway. It was not Derek's pickup truck this time. The vehicle approaching my home carried the official, unmistakable insignia of the county sheriff's department. The battle was moving from the shadows of digital records into the harsh, unforgiving light of the judicial system. The fading winter sun cast long, skeletal shadows across the frost-covered cornfields as the crunch of heavy tires on gravel announced the arrival of the county sheriff's deputy. I watched the cruiser roll up the long driveway, its light bar unlit, but unmistakably authoritative. The deputy, a young man with a tight buzz cut and a hesitant demeanor, stepped out and approached the porch. He didn't meet my eyes as he handed over the thick manila envelope, the formal seal of the county court stamped across the flap. The legal machinery Derek and my parents had set in motion was finally grinding its way into my sanctuary. I thanked the deputy, closed the heavy oak door, and carried the envelope into my home office. The satisfying click of the deadbolt felt entirely inadequate against the bureaucratic assault contained within those pages. I sat at my desk, the glow of the dual monitors reflecting off the glossy surface of the envelope, and slid my thumb under the flap. The documents detailed an expedited emergency custody hearing scheduled for a mere 3 days away. The sheer speed of the filing confirmed my suspicions regarding the local judicial ecosystem. Derek's uncle, a prominent figure in the regional freight logistics industry, frequently golfed with Judge Carter, the presiding magistrate in our small jurisdiction. They had undoubtedly leveraged those backroom connections to bypass the standard familial court docket, aiming to steamroll me before I could mount a defense. But it was the attached addendum that sent a jolt of pure, electrified rage straight through my nervous system. It was a document titled Preemptive Medical Conservatorship. The filing claimed, under penalty of perjury, that during Leo's final days, my grief had rendered me mentally incapacitated, entirely unfit to manage my own affairs, let alone those of my surviving children. The document purported to transfer my parental financial authority to Derek, effective immediately upon the date of signing. My eyes darted to the bottom of the page where my own signature supposedly authorized this devastating transfer of power. It was a blatant, calculated forgery. They were attempting to rewrite history using the darkest moments of my life to construct a narrative of instability. The audacity was breathtaking, a testament to their absolute certainty that a grieving mother would simply fold under the weight of an aggressive legal maneuver. I did not fold. I reached for my phone and dialed the only person capable of navigating this localized corruption. Allison Vance operated a formidable family law practice in Lincoln, a sharp 2-hour drive from the insular politics of my county. We met 5 years ago during a complex agricultural subsidy dispute. She was the opposing counsel, and her ruthless surgical cross-examination had nearly dismantled my meticulously crafted compliance models. We recognized the same cold structural logic in each other, a shared understanding that narrative is useless without documentation. Allison answered on the second ring, her voice crisp and immediate. I bypassed the standard greetings, launching directly into a clinical summary of the emergency summons and the forged conservatorship document. She requested a video call to review the filings. I propped my phone against the edge of the monitor, staring into the small lens as Allison's face filled the screen. Her expression was neutral, betraying none of the alarm I knew the situation warranted. "Gretchen," Allison began, her tone measured, parsing the details of the petition. "An expedited hearing with 3 coordinated family members testifying to your instability is incredibly dangerous. In these rural jurisdictions, courts heavily favor the status quo, and the status quo they are presenting is a unified front of concerned relatives attempting to rescue children from a spiraling mother. The judge's connection to Derek's uncle only compounds the threat. They are banking on the optics." I listened, absorbing the gravity of her assessment. The legal reality was grim, precisely tailored to exploit every vulnerability they believed I possessed. "They have the narrative advantage," Allison continued, her eyes scanning the digital copies of the petition I had forwarded. "To counter this, we need undeniable empirical evidence. We need to dismantle their credibility before they can cement their story. But building a forensic case in 3 days is nearly impossible." I reached across the desk, my fingers resting on the heavy crimson spine of my portfolio. I pulled the binder into the frame of the video call, the sharp plastic edges glinting under the office lights. "They have a story, Allison," I said, my voice dropping to a low, even cadence. "I have an audit." I tapped the cover, the sound sharp and definitive. I opened the binder, flipping past the indexed sections, allowing the camera to capture the dense, meticulously tabbed documentation. "Section 1, I explained, turning the pages. "The crowdfunding campaign Joan orchestrated generating over $85,000. Section 2, the digital withdrawal receipts matching the exact purchase date of a 20-acre commercial farming plot registered under Calvin's newly formed holding company. Section 3, the public lien notices and voided contracts confirming Derek's imminent bankruptcy. Section 4, the generational farming trust bypass clauses that grant control of the $4,000 monthly subsidy to whoever holds primary custody of Toby and Mia." Allison stopped reviewing the digital files on her screen. Her gaze locked onto the crimson binder, a slow, predatory smile spreading across her face. The brilliant, ruthless attorney I remembered from Lincoln recognized the lethal architecture I had constructed. "You didn't just build a defense, Gretchen," Allison murmured, the professional detachment replaced by genuine, electrified anticipation. "You built a trap." "I am a technical writer," I replied, closing the binder. "I organize chaos into profitable data." They mistook my silence for submission. "I am driving down tomorrow morning," Allison stated, her voice hardening into a decisive command. "We need to prepare the exhibits. We will let them build their house of cards as high as possible. We will not tip our hand until Derek is under oath." I ended the call, the silence of the farmhouse washing over me once more. The legal strategy was solidified. The documentation was pristine, but the psychological warfare was only just beginning. As I sat in the dim light of my office anticipating the arrival of my attorney, I realized the true challenge would not be proving their guilt. The true challenge would be surviving the final desperate measures they would employ to break me before we ever reached the courtroom. The silence was broken by a sudden jarring notification tone from my phone. It was an automated alert from the local elementary school, a system message indicating an emergency change in the authorized pickup protocols for Toby and Mia. My heart hammered against my ribs as I read the terse text message. The unified front was not waiting for the judge's gavel. They were moving to secure the primary assets right now. The automated text message from the elementary school pulsed on my phone screen, a digital alarm bell ringing in the otherwise silent farmhouse. The message was succinct and bureaucratic, stating that a modification to the emergency release protocol for Toby and Mia had been initiated. My pulse hammered against my ribs, but my mind, sharpened by the hours spent building the Crimson portfolio, bypassed panic and went straight to tactical analysis. They were not waiting for the judge's gavel. Derek and my parents understood that possession is 9/10 of the law, especially in family court disputes involving local politics. If they could physically secure the twins before the expedited hearing, they would walk into the courtroom with the ultimate bargaining chip, presenting themselves as the de facto guardians who had already rescued the children from a deteriorating situation. I grabbed my car keys and my heavy wool coat, shoving my phone into my pocket. I did not bother to run a brush through my hair or apply makeup. I needed to look exactly like the capable, focused auditor I was, devoid of the frantic energy they were hoping to provoke. The drive to Henderson Elementary took 8 minutes. The school was a low brick building nestled between the local football stadium and a stretch of dormant agricultural fields. It was the heart of the community, a place where generations of farmers and local business owners sent their kids, establishing ties that ran deep and often dangerously close. I strode through the double glass doors, my boots clicking sharply against the polished linoleum floor. The main office was a hive of morning activity, smelling faintly of laminating plastic and stale coffee. I bypassed the receptionist's desk entirely, making a direct line for the administrative corridor. Through the large, reinforced window of the principal's office, I saw the unified front in action. Joan sat in one of the plush visitor chairs, dabbing her eyes with a tissue, projecting the image of a distraught, protective grandmother. Derek stood behind her, his hands resting on the back of the chair, projecting masculine authority in his tailored leather jacket. Behind the heavy oak desk sat Principal Harrison. Harrison was a fixture in Henderson, a man who had been running the school for 20 years. He was also a man who spent his Sunday mornings drinking coffee with Calvin at the local diner, discussing crop yields and county council politics. I pushed the heavy oak door open. It swung wide, hitting the rubber doorstop with a definitive thud that silenced the room. Joan gasped a theatrical inhalation of air, pressing the tissue against her chest. Derek's jaw tightened, his posture stiffening as he turned to face me. Principal Harrison looked up, his expression a mixture of surprise and bureaucratic discomfort. "Gretchen," Harrison began adjusting his tie, attempting to assert control over the sudden intrusion. "We were just discussing the situation regarding Toby and Mia. Given the circumstances, I felt it was prudent to review their emergency release protocols." I stepped into the office, letting the heavy door swing shut behind me. I did not look at Joan. I did not look at Derek. I focused the entirety of my attention on the man sitting behind the desk. "There is no situation, Principal Harrison," I stated, my voice calm-modulated and entirely devoid of the hysteria Joan had undoubtedly been describing mere moments before my arrival. "And there are no circumstances that require a modification of my children's release protocols." Harrison cleared his throat, glancing nervously at Derek. The dynamic was clear. They had expected me to arrive in a state of frantic, weeping panic, desperate to tear my children away from their loving grandparents. Instead, they were facing a woman who radiated absolute, icy composure. "Gretchen, be reasonable," Derek interjected his voice, adopting the patronizing, patient tone he used when explaining freight logistics to a subordinate. "We are just trying to ensure the twins are in a stable environment while you take the time you need to heal. Your mother and I agree that right now they need structure." I ignored him. My silence toward my ex-husband hung in the air, thick and unyielding. I kept my gaze locked on the principal. "Principal Harrison," I continued, closing the physical distance between us until I stood directly in front of his oak desk. "I received an automated alert stating a modification had been initiated. Who initiated it?" Harrison shifted in his leather chair, the leather squeaking in protest. He looked trapped, caught between his loyalty to Calvin's family narrative and his official duties. "Derek, as the children's father, submitted a signed authorization requesting that Toby and Mia only be released to his custody effective immediately. Harrison explained, his tone defensive. He cited some very concerning health issues regarding your current ability to provide supervision. Joan corroborated those concerns. Given the recent tragedy in your family, my priority is the safety of the students. The audacity of the maneuver was breathtaking, but their execution was fatally flawed. They were relying on small-town alliances and the presumption of patriarchal authority to override explicit legal mandates. I reached into the inner pocket of my coat and extracted a folded, notarized document. It was a certified copy of the finalized divorce decree, complete with the embossed seal of the state court. I had kept it on my person ever since the sheriff's deputy arrived, knowing this exact scenario was a distinct possibility. I unfolded the document and smoothed it flat on the pristine surface of Harrison's desk, right over a stack of permission slips. "This," I said, tapping the heavy official paper with my index finger, "is the standing custody order for Toby and Mia Hayes, signed by a district court judge." Harrison looked down at the document, his brow furrowing as he tried to process the legal text. Joan sniffled loudly behind me, attempting to disrupt the momentum, but I did not break eye contact with the principal. "I direct your attention to Section 3, Paragraph B," I instructed my voice, cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "It explicitly states that primary physical custody remains solely with the mother, Gretchen Hayes, during all school hours and standard operational days. Derek's visitation rights are strictly relegated to alternating weekends and designated holidays." Derek stepped forward, leaning over the desk. "Gretchen, that order was signed years ago. Things have changed. You are not well." I finally turned my head, fixing Derek with a stare that stopped him dead in his tracks. "Nothing has changed regarding the legal jurisdiction of this document, Derek. Your signature on an arbitrary school form does not supersede a judicial mandate." I turned back to the principal, leaning in slightly, lowering my voice so that the threat carried the intimacy of a promise. "Principal Harrison," I said, enunciating every syllable with chilling clarity. "If you bypass a standing, certified court order based on the unverified hearsay of my ex-husband and my estranged mother, you are engaging in custodial interference." Harrison blanched, the color draining rapidly from his cheeks. The mention of specific legal terminology shattered the illusion of a simple family disagreement. "If you refuse to release my children to me right now," I continued, "I will not call the local sheriff, who I know plays softball with your brother. I will contact my attorney in Lincoln, and I will file a federal civil rights lawsuit against this school district, naming you personally as the primary defendant for violating my established constitutional rights as a parent." The silence in the office became absolute. The air grew thick, heavy, with the realization that they had fundamentally miscalculated their target. I was not the struggling writer Derek disdained. I was not the fragile, broken daughter Joan pitied. I was a fortress, heavily armed with undeniable legal documentation, and I was daring them to test the structural integrity of my defenses. Harrison's hands began to shake slightly. He looked at the certified court order, then at Derek, and finally up at me. The political calculus in his mind shifted instantaneously. His friendship with Calvin was not worth risking his pension, his career, and a devastating federal lawsuit. That will not be necessary, Mrs. Hayes," Harrison stammered, pulling the unauthorized release form Derek had signed from a file folder and sliding it into the shredder bin beneath his desk. "I apologize for the misunderstanding. We were simply trying to be cautious during a sensitive time." "Caution requires verifying the facts, Principal Harrison," I replied, folding the divorce decree and sliding it back into my coat pocket. "Not acting on gossip." I turned on my heel and faced Joan and Derek. They stood frozen, their unified front cracked and splintering. Joan's theatrical tears had vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated shock. Derek's posture had deflated, his arrogance punctured by the sudden realization that his small-town influence could not override ironclad paperwork. "I am taking my children home," I stated, my voice echoing in the small office. "If either of you approach them before the hearing, I will add a restraining order to the docket." I walked out of the office, the heavy oak door swinging shut behind me. I retrieved Toby and Mia from their respective classrooms, helping them into their winter coats with gentle, reassuring smiles. I did not speak of the confrontation. I simply held their small, warm hands as we walked out the double-glass doors and into the freezing Nebraska morning. The physical threat was neutralized, but the legal battle loomed closer. Derek's desperation was escalating, driving him to make reckless, aggressive moves. As I buckled the twins into the backseat of my sedan, I realized that the forged, preemptive medical conservatorship was not just a piece of paper in a file. It was the linchpin of his entire strategy, the desperate gamble of a man who believed he was untouchable. And that arrogance was exactly what my attorney and I needed to detonate his world. The adrenaline from the confrontation at the elementary school had long since burned off, leaving behind a cold, sharp exhaustion. The farmhouse was silent again, save for the rhythmic hum of the refrigerator and the soft breathing sounds of Toby and Mia asleep upstairs. I sat at the dining room table, surrounded by the physical manifestation of my defense strategy. The crimson binder lay open, its plastic sleeves reflecting the harsh glow of the overhead light. Across from me sat Allison Vance, her laptop open, legal pads scattered, her expression fixed in a state of intense clinical concentration. Allison had arrived from Lincoln shortly after sunset, carrying 2 briefcases and an aura of uncompromising competence. We had spent the last 4 hours constructing a timeline mapping the trajectory of my parents' charity fraud and Derek's imminent bankruptcy. The case was strong, built on irrefutable public records, but we needed the definitive strike. We needed the mechanism that would transform this custody dispute into a criminal referral. We found it in the paperwork the sheriff's deputy had delivered. "Let's go back to the addendum," Allison instructed, pulling the preemptive medical conservatorship document from the stack. "The petition for emergency custody relies heavily on this specific filing. This is the legal instrument Derek intends to use to seize control of the agricultural trust." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the scarred wood of the table. The document was dense with legalese, a bureaucratic attempt to formalize the theft of my autonomy. It claimed that during the final agonizing weeks of Leo's life, the psychological burden had rendered me incapable of managing financial or legal affairs. It purported to grant Derek temporary but comprehensive proxy over all assets pertaining to the surviving minor children. "Read the execution date," Allison said, tapping her pen against the bottom corner of the page. My eyes scanned down to the notary stamp and the signature line. The date, typed next to my name, was November 14th. The breath caught in my throat. The room seemed to shrink, the air turning thin and icy. November 14th. 2 weeks ago. On November 14th, Leo's respiratory function had plummeted. The oncology team at the pediatric hospice wing had initiated the final palliative protocols. The monitors beeped with a slow, devastating finality. I had pulled a hard plastic chair to the edge of his bed, woven my fingers through his frail hand, and refused to move. I did not eat. I did not sleep. I did not leave the 3rd floor of that hospital for 48 consecutive hours. "I didn't sign this." I whispered the words, carrying the weight of a horrific realization. "I was at the hospice center. I didn't leave Leo's room." Allison's eyes widened slightly, the professional detachment cracking to reveal a sharp, predatory intellect. "Are you absolutely certain No trips to the cafeteria, no brief meetings with administrators in the lobby. I am certain, I replied, my voice gaining strength, hardening into iron. The charge nurse Sarah brought me coffee. The attending physician checked in every 2 hours. There are security cameras at the elevators. I did not step foot outside that ward. Then we have a physical alibi, Allison said, making a rapid note on her legal pad. It is physically impossible for you to have executed a legal document in a different location on that date. She slid the conservatorship paper across the table toward me. Look closely at the signature, Gretchen. Tell me what you see. I focused on the ink. The name, Gretchen Hayes, was scrawled across the designated line. To a casual observer or a rushed county clerk, it might pass for my handwriting. It captured the general slant and the cursive connections, but I was not a casual observer. I was a technical writer who spent years dissecting the minutiae of compliance documents. I knew my own signature the way a jeweler knows the flaws in a diamond. I pointed to the first letter, the G. Allison leaned in, tracing the path of my finger. What about it? I print the capital G in my signature, I explained, the memory of long nights auditing freight logs surfacing with startling clarity. I never loop it. But look at this one. The upper curve loops back on itself, connecting heavily to the R. I pulled my hand back, a cold, sickening realization washing over me. Derek loops his G. He does it on every bill of lading, every check he writes. It is a specific ingrained motor habit. Allison nodded, her gaze fixed on the paper. A subconscious tell. Forgers often project their own kinetic patterns onto the copied signature. But the loop was not the most damning detail. The true anomaly lay not in the shape of the letters, but in the substance used to form them. The signature was rendered in a highly specific, vibrant sapphire blue. It was not the dull utilitarian ink found in standard hospital ballpoint pens, the kind scattered across nursing stations and waiting room desks. The color was rich, pooling slightly at the bottom curves of the letters, indicating a heavy, continuous flow. Look at the ink color, Allison, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She examined the signature again, squinting under the harsh dining room light. It's distinct. A fountain pen, maybe. It is a custom-ordered fountain pen, I confirmed, the anger finally breaking through the ice, a hot, searing current. Derek's prized possession. He bought it 5 years ago when he signed his first major logistics contract. He refuses to use anything else for official documents. He thinks it projects authority. The silence in the farmhouse was absolute. The sinister architecture of Derek's plan stood fully revealed, stripped of its legal veneer. While I was sitting in a sterile hospital room, holding the hand of my dying son, listening to the agonizing rhythm of a failing ventilator, my ex-husband was sitting in his dispatch office. He uncapped his expensive sapphire blue fountain pen. He forged my name onto a legal document designed to strip me of my remaining children and seize their agricultural trust to save his bankrupt trucking company. He had commodified my tragedy, using the exact moment of my greatest vulnerability to execute a hostile corporate takeover. Allison sat back in her chair. A slow, terrifying smile spread across her face. It was not a smile of comfort. It was the smile of a legal predator who had just discovered the fatal weakness in the opposition's armor. They did not just file a baseless custody petition, Gretchen, Allison said, her voice thrumming with dangerous energy. They filed a forged federal proxy. That elevates this from a civil family court dispute to felony fraud and perjury. Do we notify the court now? I asked, my fingers tracing the edge of the crimson binder. No, Allison replied instantly, shaking her head. We say nothing. If we alert them now, Derek will claim it was a clerical error. He will say his assistant stamped the wrong date, or he will withdraw the petition entirely to avoid criminal charges. They will scatter, and they will try this again when we are less prepared. She tapped the forged signature with her pen. We let him walk into that courtroom. We let him raise his right hand. We let him swear under oath before a judge that he witnessed you sign this document on November 14th. We let him perjure himself completely. And then we spring the trap. The strategy was flawless, cold, and utterly devastating. We would weaponize his arrogance. I closed the crimson binder, the plastic snapping shut with finality. The documentation was secure. The ambush was set. But the waiting was a different kind of torture. We had 48 hours until the emergency hearing. 48 hours where Derek and my parents believed they held all the cards, where they would undoubtedly escalate their psychological warfare to ensure I arrived at the courthouse shattered and compliant. As if on cue, the lights above the dining room table flickered, dimming momentarily before returning to their harsh fluorescent glare. A second later, my phone vibrated against the wood. It was a notification from the power company. I swiped the screen, my eyes scanning the automated alert. The battle had shifted again, moving from the legal arena directly into the physical sanctuary of my home. The farmhouse plunged into sudden, suffocating darkness. 1 second, the overhead kitchen bulb cast its familiar yellow glow across the worn linoleum, and the next, the world simply ceased to emit light. The constant, reassuring hum of the refrigerator died. The forced air furnace rattled to a halt, leaving only the sound of the bitter Nebraska wind lashing against the vinyl siding. I stood frozen by the dining room table, waiting for the backup grid to engage. Nothing happened. The digital clock on the microwave remains an empty black rectangle. I reached into my coat pocket and retrieved my phone, activating the flashlight feature. The stark white beam sliced through the shadows, illuminating the dust particles suspended in the frigid air. I navigated down the hallway toward the utility closet, my boots padding softly against the hardwood. I flipped the heavy metal latch on the breaker box and ran my thumb down the row of switches. None were tripped. The grid was fine. The issue was localized entirely to my meter. I brought the phone screen closer to my face, squinting against the glare, and opened the local power company's application. A bright crimson banner spanned the top of the dashboard. Service suspended. Payment declined. My brow furrowed. I had set up an automatic draft for the utilities years ago, linking it to a secondary financial reservoir. I toggled over to my primary banking portal, my thumb authenticating the login via a biometric scan. The ledger loaded, displaying a string of devastating red numerals. The joint college savings account established for Toby and Mia shortly after their birth held a balance of 0 available funds. A bold, capitalized tag sat beside the routing number. Frozen, pending litigation. The sheer, breathtaking pettiness of the maneuver struck me like a physical blow. During our marriage, Derek and I had opened that specific account with dual custodian status. I used it as an overflow mechanism for household emergencies, a safety net we agreed to maintain even after the divorce. Derek had weaponized a standard banking protocol. By submitting the emergency custody petition and claiming a formal legal dispute over the children's welfare, he triggered an automatic administrative freeze on their associated assets. He knew the utility auto draft pulled from that exact routing number on the 15th of the month. He calculated the timing with meticulous precision. He wanted the power shut off. He wanted the farmhouse to freeze. Derek intended to plunge me into darkness on the eve of the most consequential hearing of my life. He envisioned me huddled under a blanket, shivering, terrified, and overwhelmed by the compounding failures of my existence. He believed the sudden loss of heat and light would serve as the final psychological hammer, shattering my resolve and forcing me to beg for a truce before the sun even rose. He fundamentally misunderstood the woman he had married. I walked back into the kitchen, the flashlight beam sweeping across the countertops until it caught the shape of a brass candlestick holder. I opened the corner drawer, retrieved a box of wooden matches, and struck one against the abrasive strip. The sulfur hissed, flaring into a brilliant, warm, orange teardrop. I touched the flame to the wick. The small fire flickered, casting long, dancing shadows against the floral wallpaper. I lit 3 more candles, carrying them into the home office and placing them strategically around the oak desk. The farmhouse grew colder by the minute, the insulation fighting a losing battle against the sub-zero temperatures outside. I kept my heavy wool coat zipped to my chin and pulled a knitted blanket from the sofa, wrapping it tightly around my waist. I walked upstairs, my steps silent on the carpeted treads, and checked on the twins. Toby and Mia were nestled deep beneath layers of thick quilts, their breathing slow and rhythmic, entirely oblivious to the tactical strike their father had just launched. I returned to the office, taking my seat in the ergonomic chair. The candlelight danced across the surface of the crimson binder. I did not feel despair. I felt an exhilarating, razor-sharp clarity. The frozen bank account was not a defeat. It was a gift. It provided yet another documented instance of financial manipulation, another piece of evidence demonstrating Derek's willingness to inflict environmental harm on his own children to achieve leverage. He had handed Allison another weapon to wield during cross-examination. My phone vibrated against the wood of the desk, the sudden buzzing startling in the quiet room. The screen illuminated, displaying a missed call notification, followed instantly by a new voicemail alert. The caller identification text read simply, Joan. I did not bring the device to my ear. I tapped the speakerphone icon, allowing my mother's voice to fill the freezing office. Gretchen, the audio began. Her tone was a masterclass in weaponized pity. It possessed the sickly sweet resonance of honey poured over broken glass. I know things are unraveling for you tonight. I know it feels like the walls are closing in. She paused, allowing the silence to stretch, undoubtedly picturing me crying on the floor. Surrender gracefully, Gretchen, Joan continued, her voice dropping to a theatrical, pleading whisper. Do not make this ugly in a courtroom tomorrow. You are already broken. We can all see it. Do not break the twins, too. Call Derek. Tell him you concede. We will let you see them on holidays. Just let it go. The recording ended with a soft click. I sat motionless in the candlelight. Society dictates a specific script for a moment like this. A mother betrayed by her own parents, terrorized by her former spouse, sitting in a freezing house, is supposed to weep. She is supposed to crumble under the sheer, suffocating weight of the injustice. My tear ducts remained desert dry. My pulse held a steady, unhurried rhythm. The voicemail was the final catalyst. For 30 years, I carried the invisible, suffocating baggage of their projections. I was the disappointing daughter who prioritized logistics over charm. I was the struggling ex-wife who failed to appreciate a visionary entrepreneur. I internalized their slights, their subtle undermining, their constant simmering disapproval. As the candle wax melted, pooling into hot, translucent circles, I shed those identities entirely. They sloughed off my shoulders like dead skin. I was no longer bound by the social contract of familial duty. I was a mother, defending her territory against hostile invaders. I was the apex predator in this specific bureaucratic ecosystem. My fingers moved swiftly across the phone screen. I saved the audio file, titled it Exhibit Joan, Pre-Hearing Intimidation, and attached it to an encrypted email addressed to Allison. I pressed send. The digital packet flew into the ether, securing her own words in the arsenal we would unleash at dawn. I reached out and pulled the heavy cover of the crimson binder shut. The sharp snap of the plastic echoed like a gunshot in the silent house. I slid the portfolio into my leather briefcase, snapping the brass buckles securely into place. I reviewed my mental checklist, ensuring every document, every forged signature analysis, and every printed bank lien sat perfectly tabbed and indexed. I blew out the candles, plunging the office back into total, unforgiving darkness. I did not need the light. I knew exactly where I was going. Hours later, the eastern horizon cracked open, bleeding a pale, icy blue across the Nebraska sky. I drove toward the county courthouse, the heater in my sedan blasting against my frozen boots. The towering limestone facade of the judicial building loomed at the end of Main Street, its grand columns projecting an aura of impartial justice. I parked the car, gripped the handle of my briefcase, and walked toward the concrete steps. The biting wind whipped my hair across my face, but I barely registered the cold. At the top of the grand staircase, standing beneath the arched entryway, the unified front awaited. Joan wore a somber navy blue dress. Calvin stood rigidly beside her, his hands clasped behind his back. Derek flanked them, looking immaculate in a tailored suit, projecting unshakable confidence. They were surrounded by a team of 3 expensive, polished attorneys, laughing softly among themselves, reviewing their notes with the casual ease of a guaranteed victory. They turned their heads in unison as my boots struck the first stone step. The theatrical performance was about to begin, and they were entirely unaware that the stage they had built was rigged to collapse. The heavy oak doors of a county courthouse swung shut behind me, sealing us inside a chamber built on the veneer of impartial justice. The room smelled of lemon floor wax and old paper, a sterile environment designed to strip away the messy realities of the lives being debated within its walls. I took my seat at the defense table next to Allison, the heavy crimson binder resting exactly in the center of the faux wood laminate surface. Judge Carter presided from the elevated bench, his wire-rimmed glasses perched low on his nose. He projected an air of weary authority, the kind of small-town magistrate who had seen every variation of domestic squalor and preferred cases that resolved quickly and cleanly. I knew his history. I knew he golfed with Derek's uncle. I knew the social currents of this town favored the wealthy, the established, and the loud. The bailiff called the court to order, and the emergency custody hearing officially began. Derek's attorney, a slick, high-priced litigator imported from Omaha, opened the proceedings with a masterclass in character assassination. He painted a picture of a fractured, unstable woman, unhinged by tragedy, living in a freezing house with shut-off utilities, incapable of providing basic care for her surviving children. He spoke of the necessity for immediate intervention using words like rescue and stability. Then the prosecution called their first witness. My mother Joan approached the stand. She wore a conservative navy blue dress that signaled solemnity and respectability. She carried a small embroidered handkerchief. As she took the oath, her voice trembled just enough to convey profound sorrow without crossing into hysteria. It was a perfectly calibrated performance. For the next 20 minutes, Joan testified to my supposed descent into madness. She described a daughter who had completely detached from reality following Leo's passing. She claimed I refused to eat, refused to bathe the twins, and hoarded Leo's medical supplies in a state of paranoid delusion. She recounted the staged confrontation at the grocery store, twisting the narrative to portray my silent, icy departure as evidence of a catatonic break. "I tried to hold her," Joan sobbed, dabbing her dry eyes with a handkerchief. "I begged her to let us help, but she just stared at me. It was like looking into an empty house." She is not there anymore, Your Honor. She is not capable of being a mother right now. We just want to protect Toby and Mia before she does something irreversible. Judge Carter leaned forward, his expression softening into genuine sympathy. The narrative was working. The image of the sacrificing, heartbroken grandmother, desperate to save her innocent grandchildren, was a powerful archetype, one that the court was eager to embrace. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded over the red binder. I did not shake my head in denial. I did not whisper frantic objections to Allison. I simply watched the performance, cataloging every perjury, every fabricated detail. They were constructing a towering edifice of lies, and I was allowing them to build it as high as possible. Joan stepped down, returning to the gallery, where Calvin offered a supportive squeeze of her shoulder. Next, Derek took the stand. He projected an entirely different archetype. He was the successful, stable patriarch the captain of industry forced to step in and clean up the mess left by his failing ex-wife. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, his posture straight, his tone measured and authoritative. He testified to his own fabricated heroics. He spoke of his thriving logistics company, conveniently omitting the voided contracts and the severed credit lines. He painted a picture of a man ready and willing to provide a secure, affluent environment for his children, contrasting it sharply with my supposedly destitute existence. I tried to be patient, Your Honor, Derek stated, adjusting his cuffs. I tried to give Gretchen the space she needed to grieve. But when she allowed the utilities to be shut off in the dead of winter, I knew I had to act. I cannot allow my children to freeze because their mother refuses to accept reality. He then introduced the linchpin of his strategy. Derek's attorney approached the bench, submitting the preemptive medical conservatorship into evidence. Your Honor, the attorney announced. My client recognized the severity of Mrs. Hayes' decline weeks ago. During the final tragic days of their eldest son's life, Mrs. Hayes acknowledged her inability to manage her affairs. She signed this conservatorship, transferring temporary financial and legal proxy to my client. This document demonstrates that even Mrs. Hayes recognized she was unfit. Judge Carter reviewed the document, nodding slowly. The trap was springing exactly as they had designed it. I looked at Derek. He met my gaze from the witness stand. There was a flicker of arrogant triumph in his eyes. He believed he had won. He believed the sudden power outage had broken me, that my silence at the defense table was the quiet surrender of a defeated woman. He had no idea that my silence was the terrible, coiled tension of an apex predator, waiting for the prey to step fully into the snare. Mr. Hayes, the judge asked, peering over his glasses, you are testifying under oath that you witnessed Gretchen Hayes sign this document, voluntarily transferring her financial authority to you. I am, Your Honor, Derek replied smoothly, without a microsecond of hesitation. She signed it in my dispatch office on November 14th. She knew she was losing her grip, and she asked me to step in. The perjury was absolute. It was recorded by the court stenographer. It was sealed into the official judicial record. Derek had just committed a felony in open court. I felt a surge of cold electric energy travel down my spine. The preparation was over. The execution was about to commence. Allison leaned over her shoulder, brushing mine. Are you ready? She whispered, her voice barely audible over the ambient hum of the courtroom. I unclasped the brass buckles of my briefcase. I slid the thick crimson binder out and centered it squarely in front of me. The plastic cover caught the overhead light, a glaring, violent splash of color against the drab legal furnishings. Tear them apart, I said. Allison stood up. The sound of her chair scraping against the linoleum floor echoed like a gunshot. The prosecution had rested their narrative. It was time for the cross-examination. It was time to open the ledger. The echo of Derek's perjury settled into the pores of the courtroom walls. Judge Carter made a brief note on his legal pad, his pen scratching loudly in the quiet space. He looked up, peering over his glasses at our table. He asked if the defense wished to cross-examine the witness. Allison Vance did not scramble for her notes. She did not rush. She stood up, smoothing the front of her tailored jacket. The scrape of her chair against the linoleum signaled the turning of the tide. "Your Honor," Allison said, her voice clear and resonant. "The defense reserves the right to cross-examine Mr. Hayes shortly. However, to establish the factual timeline of this petition, I must first recall Joan to the stand." Derek's attorney frowned, adjusting his tie, but offered no formal objection. The judge nodded. Joan rose from her seat in the front row of the gallery. She smoothed her navy blue dress, her chin tilted upward. She believed she had already won. She walked back to the witness box with the practiced grace of a martyr, ready to deliver another round of tearful anecdotes regarding my supposed mental collapse. She sat down, folding her hands in her lap. She looked at Allison with a mixture of polite patience and hidden disdain. Allison walked to the center of the floor. She carried only a sleek black tablet and a remote control for the overhead projector. I remained seated at the defense table, my hands resting lightly on the cover of the crimson binder. I opened the rings, extracting the first stack of plastic sleeves, and handed them to the bailiff to enter into the official record. "Mrs. Hayes," Allison began, her tone devoid of any emotional inflection. "You testified earlier that your daughter, Gretchen, has been neglecting her financial and parental responsibilities due to debilitating grief. You painted a picture of a household in ruin. I want to shift our focus to your own financial activities over the past 12 months. Joan blinked, her smile faltering just a fraction. "I do not see how my personal finances are relevant to my daughter's breakdown." "The relevance will become clear very shortly," Allison replied. She pressed a button on her remote. A large projector screen unrolled from the ceiling above the judge's bench. The equipment hummed to life, casting a bright rectangular glow across the dim room. Allison tapped her tablet. A digital image populated the screen. It was the crowdfunding page. The photograph of Leo in his baseball cap beamed down at the courtroom. The bold text pleaded for the community to save their grandson. Below the photo, the total raised sat frozen in stark green numerals. $85,420. A murmur rippled through the gallery. I turned my head slightly, catching sight of the back rows. The pews were populated by a handful of locals, including Patricia and Susan, the very women who had cornered me in the grocery store aisle. They leaned forward, their eyes widening at the sum displayed on the screen. "Do you recognize this web page, Mrs. Hayes?" Allison asked, stepping closer to the witness box. Joan swallowed hard, her throat bobbed. "Yes, it was a charity drive. The town was so generous. We wanted to help with Leo's medical bills." "A noble effort," Allison noted, her voice crisp. She tapped the tablet again. The screen split down the middle. On the left remained the fundraiser. On the right, a detailed bank ledger appeared, authorized by subpoena. "This is the transaction history for the bank account linked to that specific campaign," Allison stated, addressing the judge before turning back to the witness. "Can you read the final withdrawal entry for the court, please? Just the date and the amount." Joan gripped the wooden rail of the witness box. Her knuckles turned white. She squinted at the screen, her mouth opening and closing without producing a sound. "If you are having trouble reading it, I can provide a printed copy," Allison offered, her politeness sharp as a scalpel. "October 14th, Joan croaked, her voice stripped of its prior theatrical resonance. $85,000. "Thank you," Allison said. "A lump sum withdrawal effectively emptying the account. Now, did you transfer those funds to Gretchen to pay for pediatric hospice care? Gretchen was too proud, Joan stammered, reciting the excuse she had fed the town. She refused to discuss money. I was holding it for when she was ready. Holding it, Allison repeated, letting the phrase hang in the cold air. Let us examine how you held it. Allison tapped the tablet a third time. The crowdfunding image vanished. In its place, a formal county property deed appeared, alongside the registration documents for Golden Harvest Holdings, LLC. The murmur in the gallery grew louder, a wave of restless whispers. I watched Patricia whisper something urgent into Susan's ear. Their expressions of pious pity were dissolving into rigid masks of confusion and dawning horror. This is a commercial real estate deed for a 20-acre parcel of prime agricultural land situated just outside the county line, Allison explained, pacing a slow, deliberate path in front of the jury box. The purchaser is listed as Golden Harvest Holdings, LLC. Mrs. Hayes, who is the registered agent for this corporation. Joan looked at Calvin. My father sat paralyzed in the front row, his jaw slack, his face draining of blood. He did not offer her a nod of encouragement. He looked like a man watching an oncoming train. My husband, Joan whispered. Calvin. And can you read the purchase price listed on this deed? Allison demanded, her voice rising, cutting through the murmurs. Joan closed her eyes, shaking her head side to side. The conservative navy dress suddenly looked like a prison uniform. Please read the purchase price for the record, Mrs. Hayes, Judge Carter instructed, his tone no longer sympathetic. It was stern, laced with profound irritation. Joan opened her eyes. Tears spilled over her lashes, but these were born of pure, unadulterated panic. $85,000. And the date of the transaction, Allison pressed, stepping within 2 feet of the witness stand. October 14th, Joan replied, her voice breaking into a dry sob. Allison turned her back on my mother, facing the gallery and the judge. On the exact same day, you drained a charity account funded by the goodwill of this community, an account created using the face of a dying child. Your husband purchased 20 acres of commercial farmland in a cash transaction for the exact same amount. You did not hold those funds for your daughter's grief. You converted them into a real estate portfolio. The courtroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of gasps and outraged whispers. Patricia stood up in the second row, her hand clamped over her mouth, staring at Joan as if she were looking at a stranger. Susan's face flushed a deep, mottled red. The social architecture my mother had spent 12 months building, the careful manipulation of the town's sympathies, burned to the ground in less than 3 minutes. Derek's attorney jumped to his feet, objecting to relevance, arguing that this was a custody hearing, not a financial tribunal. Allison pivoted, her eyes flashing with predatory triumph. It is highly relevant, Your Honor. The petitioners are attempting to seize custody of 2 minor children to qualify for state kinship stipends, covering up an extensive documented fraud. They are projecting their own moral bankruptcy onto my client. They claim she is unfit, yet they are the ones exploiting a pediatric tragedy for personal gain. Judge Carter slammed his gavel down, the sharp crack silencing the room. He sustained the line of questioning, glaring at Joan with visible disgust. The veneer of the sacrificing grandmother was entirely destroyed. Joan sat slumped in the wooden chair, her hands trembling uncontrollably, her eyes darting frantically toward the exit. She had nothing left to say. Her perjury was exposed in black and white ink, projected large enough for the entire town to see. I sat at the defense table, my pulse steady, my breathing even. I did not smile. I did not gloat. The satisfaction was a quiet internal hum, the validation of every late night spent organizing the crimson binder. I had survived the siege, and now I was dismantling their fortress, stone by stone. Allison dismissed Joan from the stand. My mother stumbled down the steps, avoiding the burning glares of the community members she had swindled. She collapsed into the seat next to Calvin, burying her face in her hands. The first phase of the trap had sprung perfectly, neutralizing the character assassination. But the financial fraud was only a prelude. The most lethal weapon remained hidden in the plastic sleeves on my desk. Allison walked back to our table, her eyes bright with adrenaline. She placed her tablet down and picked up the next stack of documents. She turned toward the judge, her posture straightening, her voice ringing out clear and commanding. The defense calls Derek Hayes back to the stand. The real destruction was about to begin. The heavy wooden chair in the witness box groaned in protest as Derek settled his frame into the seat. He adjusted the lapels of his charcoal suit, projecting an aura of unflappable corporate authority. He had just watched my mother's reputation disintegrate into ash, yet his posture remained rigid with arrogance. He believed Joan's downfall was a mere collateral casualty. In his mind, her financial crimes had zero bearing on his carefully orchestrated custody petition. He still held the trump card. He still possessed the legal proxy that would hand him control of the generational farming trust, ensuring his bankrupt logistics fleet survived another fiscal quarter. He looked across the courtroom, his gaze landing on me with a quiet, dismissive sneer. He mistook my stillness for shock. Allison Vance stood in the center of the floor. She did not carry the sleek digital tablet she had used to dismantle Joan. Instead, she held a single manila folder, the edges crisp and sharp. She approached the witness stand with the measured, predatory grace of a hunter who has already cornered her prey and is simply savoring the final strike. Mr. Hayes Allison began, her voice carrying a deceptive warmth. We heard your previous testimony regarding the preemptive medical conservatorship. You stated under oath that my client, Gretchen Hayes, voluntarily surrendered her financial and legal authority over her surviving children. Derek offered a grim, practiced nod. That is correct. Gretchen recognized she was no longer capable of managing her affairs. The grief was too profound. She asked me to step in and secure Toby and Mia's future. And you are testifying that you physically witnessed her sign this document?
Allison pressed, stepping closer to the wooden rail.
Yes.
Derek replied, smoothly, his tone laced with manufactured pity. She signed it right in front of me. Can you please confirm the exact date and location of this signing for the court record? Allison asked, pausing to let the court stenographer's keystrokes echo in the quiet room.
Derek did not hesitate. The trap was invisible to him. November 14th, he stated with total conviction. She drove to my dispatch office on the east side of town. We sat at my desk, discussed the situation, and she executed a document. The perjury hung in the air, a toxic, invisible cloud. Derek had just cemented his lie into the official judicial transcript. He had sworn before a sitting judge that I had visited his commercial property on a very specific Tuesday. Allison turned her back on him. She walked to the defense table, opened the manila folder, and extracted a thick stack of paper bound by a heavy metal clip. She handed the stack to the bailiff, requesting it be entered into evidence. Your Honor, Allison addressed the bench, her voice dropping its warm veneer, replacing it with cold, unyielding steel. The defense submits Exhibit D, comprising the certified visitor logs, electronic badge swipe records, and sworn affidavits from the attending medical staff at the County Pediatric Hospice Center for the 48-hour period encompassing November 14th. Judge Carter adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, accepting the stack from the bailiff. The rhythmic scratching of his pen ceased. He began to read, his brow furrowing deeper with each turning page. Mr. Hayes, Allison said, pivoting back to face the witness box. The records just submitted to the court paint a very different reality than the one you just described. On November 14th, my client's eldest son, Leo, entered the final palliative stages of terminal illness. The medical logs show that Gretchen Hayes entered the third-floor hospice ward at 6 in the morning on November 13th and did not exit those locked double doors until the evening of November 15th. Derek shifted in his chair, his tailored suit suddenly appearing a fraction too tight across his broad shoulders. He cleared his throat. Perhaps I was mistaken about the exact day. It might have been the 15th. Allison did not let him breathe. She stepped forward, her gaze boring into his faltering facade. It was not the 15th. The sworn affidavit from Nurse Sarah Jenkins confirms my client never left her son's bedside. She did not visit the cafeteria. She did not go down to the lobby. She sat in a plastic chair holding her dying child's hand for 2 straight days. It was physically impossible for Gretchen Hayes to be sitting in your commercial dispatch office. A heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the courtroom. The gallery, still reeling from the revelation of Joan's charity fraud, held its collective breath. The narrative of the unstable, negligent mother was fracturing into a million irreparable pieces, revealing the monstrous truth underneath. Derek opened his mouth to pivot, his eyes darting toward his expensive defense attorney searching for a lifeline. Before his lawyer could utter an objection, the heavy oak doors at the rear of the courtroom swung open with a resounding thud. Heads turned in unison. A familiar figure stood in the threshold, breathing heavily, clutching a small silver object in his right hand. It was the principal from the local elementary school. His face was flushed, his tie slightly askew. The morning confrontation in his administrative office had clearly shattered his political loyalty. Confronted with the very real threat of a federal civil rights lawsuit, he had chosen the bitter pill of self-preservation over his decades-long friendship with my father. He recognized the sinking ship and decided to hand over the anchor. The principal marched down the center aisle, bypassing the murmuring gallery. He approached the low wooden gate separating the spectators from the legal proceedings, extending his hand toward my attorney. He did not speak a single word, but his terrified, apologetic glance in my direction spoke volumes. Allison walked to the gate, accepting the small silver flash drive from his trembling fingers. She handed it directly to the court clerk, requesting it be loaded onto the overhead projector immediately. "Your Honor," Allison announced, her voice ringing with undeniable triumph. "This drive contains security footage from Henderson Elementary captured yesterday morning, prior to the commencement of this hearing. It serves as direct evidence of a coordinated conspiracy to commit custodial interference." The projector hummed back to life. A grainy black and white video populated the screen. It depicted the school parking lot, the frosty asphalt illuminated by harsh security lights. Derek's heavy-duty black pickup truck sat idling near the entrance. Joan walked into the frame, her breath visible in the freezing air. She leaned over the hood of the truck, handing Derek a stack of manila folders. They spoke in hurried, animated gestures, reviewing the unauthorized release forms they intended to use to isolate my children. The footage proved premeditation. It proved they were working in tandem, subverting legal mandates to secure physical possession of Toby and Mia. Derek's complexion lost its ruddy, confident hue, fading into a sickly, translucent gray. His hands gripped the armrests of the witness chair, his knuckles white. The fortress he had built upon a foundation of arrogance was collapsing, but the final lethal blow was yet to be delivered. Allison retrieved her digital tablet from the defense table. She swiped the screen, replacing the parking lot footage with a high-resolution scan of the preemptive medical conservatorship. She enlarged the image, zooming in on the bottom right corner, until my supposed signature dominated the glowing screen. "Mr. Hayes," Allison said, her tone dropping to a dangerous clinical whisper. Let us examine the mechanics of this forgery. She pointed a laser pointer at the first letter of the signature. The bright red dot danced over the ink. My client is a meticulous technical writer, Allison explained to the judge. Her profession requires exacting precision. When Gretchen Hayes signs her name, she prints the capital letter G with rigid architectural straight lines. She never loops the upper curve. Yet the signature on this binding legal document features a highly distinct continuous loop connecting the top of the G directly to the lowercase r. Allison turned the laser pointer toward the witness box, letting the red dot rest on the pristine lapel of Derek's charcoal suit. That specific continuous loop is a motor habit you display on every single bill of lading, every corporate check, and every freight manifest you authorize, she stated, her words striking like physical blows. You projected your own kinetic pattern onto a fraudulent signature. Derek opened his mouth, but only a dry, raspy wheeze escaped. He looked like a man drowning in a shallow pool. But the most damning anomaly, Allison continued pacing slowly toward him, is not the shape of the letters. It is the chemical composition of the ink itself. She pointed back to the screen, highlighting the rich, pooling color of the scrawled name. This signature is not rendered in standard black or generic ballpoint blue. It is a highly specific, vibrant sapphire hue. The ink pools heavily at the curves, indicating a continuous flow mechanism. It is the exact distinct shade produced by the custom-ordered silver-barreled fountain pen currently resting in the breast pocket of your suit jacket. The silence in the room became a physical entity crushing the air out of the lungs of everyone present. Allison stepped directly in front of the witness stand. She did not yell. She did not need to raise her voice to ensure her words echoed forever in the annals of that county courthouse. You did not rescue your children from a destitute mother, Mr. Hayes, Allison stated, delivering the final catastrophic truth. You forged a federal document to steal their agricultural trust, and you used your prized fountain pen to do it, while their mother was in a hospice ward holding her dying son. Derek went completely pale. The last remnants of blood drained from his face, leaving him looking like a chalk outline. His jaw hung slack. He looked down at his own breast pocket, the silver clip of the fountain pen gleaming under the fluorescent lights condemning him in plain sight. The civil custody hearing had evaporated. The courtroom had just become an active crime scene, and the judge reached for his gavel with a fury that promised absolute destruction. The silence that followed Allison's final statement was a physical entity. It pressed against the walls of the county courtroom, heavy and suffocating, thick enough to suffocate the remaining air out of the room. Derek sat frozen in the witness box. His eyes remained locked on the glowing projection screen where the enlarged sapphire blue ink of his own handwriting condemned him in stark detail. He looked down at his chest, his gaze catching the silver clip of the custom fountain pen resting in his breast pocket. The polished metal gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lighting, a silent witness to his own self-inflicted destruction. His high-priced litigator from Omaha shifted his weight at the petitioner table. The lawyer did not stand to object. He did not offer a defense regarding the ink analysis or the security footage. He looked at the digital projection, then turned his head slowly to look at his client. The attorney possessed decades of experience in contentious family disputes, but he recognized the vast, insurmountable chasm separating a bitter custody battle from a documented felony fraud case. He crossed his arms over his tailored suit, leaning back in his chair, putting visible, deliberate space between himself and the man who had just perjured himself before a sitting judge. Judge Carter did not reach for his wooden gavel to call a recess. He did not summon the attorneys into his private chambers for a hushed consultation. He removed his wire-rimmed glasses, folding the arms with slow, deliberate precision, and set them down on the scarred mahogany block. When he looked up, the sympathetic magistrate who had listened to my mother's tearful performance had vanished. In his place sat a furious, unyielding instrument of the judicial system. Mr. Hayes, the judge, began, his voice dropping an octave, resonating with a cold, terrifying authority that echoed across the wooden pews. You came into my courtroom requesting an emergency ex parte order. You ask this court to strip a grieving mother of her fundamental parental rights. You stood under oath and testified that she was a danger to her surviving children. You presented a narrative of rescue and stability. The judge placed his hands flat on the bench, leaning forward until his shadow stretched across the floorboards. Instead, the defense has provided empirical, undeniable evidence that you and your former in-laws orchestrated a predatory conspiracy. You fabricated a medical proxy. You forged a federal document to hijack a generational agricultural trust. You coordinated a physical interception at a public elementary school. And you did this while the respondent was sitting in a palliative care ward, holding the hand of her dying 12-year-old son. Derek opened his mouth, a desperate, dry wheeze escaping his throat. Your Honor, I can explain the timeline. There was a misunderstanding regarding the date. You will remain silent, Judge Carter snapped the command, striking the room like a physical blow. You have forfeited your right to control this narrative, Mr. Hayes. Your perjury is on the official record. The court stenographer has captured every fabricated syllable you uttered today. The judge turned his piercing gaze toward the front row of the gallery, fixing his eyes on Joan and Calvin. My father sat rigid, his complexion the color of wet ash, staring blankly at the floor. My mother gripped the edge of the wooden pew, her knuckles stark white, her breathing shallow and erratic. Furthermore, the judge continued, his tone laced with profound disgust. This court has reviewed the financial ledgers submitted by the defense. The evidence suggests that you, Joan and Calvin Hayes, manipulated the goodwill of this community, siphoning tens of thousands of dollars intended for pediatric cancer treatments to purchase commercial real estate. You exploited a tragic illness to expand a personal portfolio, and you attempted to use the family court system to silence the only person capable of exposing your theft. Judge Carter picked up his pen, his hand moving swiftly across the official docket sheets. The emergency petition for temporary custody is dismissed with extreme prejudice, he declared, the legal terminology sealing their fate. Based on the extraordinary evidence of fraud, custodial interference, and moral turpitude demonstrated by the petitioners, I am issuing an immediate, unilateral modification to the standing divorce decree. Gretchen Hayes is hereby granted sole legal and physical custody of Toby and Mia Hayes. Mr. Hayes, your visitation rights are suspended indefinitely, pending a comprehensive psychological and criminal review. The gavel struck the sounding block, a sharp, definitive crack that finalized my children's safety. But the judge was not finished. He turned to the court clerk seated to his left. Transcribe this entire session immediately, Judge Carter ordered. Forward the certified record along with all defense exhibits directly to the district attorney's office. I am issuing formal referrals for Derek Hayes, Joan Hayes, and Calvin Hayes. The district attorney will review this matter for charges including, but not limited to, felony perjury, forgery of a legal instrument, wire fraud, and the embezzlement of charitable funds. A collective stunned gasp rippled through the gallery. The local community women who had judged me in the grocery store aisle sat paralyzed, bearing witness to the total incineration of the social hierarchy my mother had spent a lifetime building. At that exact moment, a sharp mechanical vibration pierced the heavy silence of the room. It was a cell phone, resting face down on the petitioner table. It buzzed once, a short, jarring sound. Then it buzzed again. Within seconds, the device erupted into a sustained, relentless rattle against the faux wood laminate surface, vibrating with frantic urgency. Derek stumbled down from the witness box, his legs unsteady beneath him. He approached his table and reached for the device with trembling fingers. He flipped the screen upward. The bright backlight illuminated his pale, sweating face. I sat at the defense table, my posture straight, observing the final, devastating mechanism of the trap we had set. Allison Vance leaned toward me, a quiet, predatory satisfaction radiating from her expression. She did not need to see the screen to know who was calling. An hour before we walked through the courthouse doors while Derek and Joan were busy rehearsing their theatrical lies, Allison had executed a synchronized financial strike. She filed the forensic vendor logs and the verified bankruptcy data directly with the State Transportation Authority and Derek's primary commercial creditors. The lien holders were no longer waiting for the end of the fiscal quarter. Confronted with hard evidence of impending insolvency, they triggered their default clauses. Derek stared at the cascading notifications on his phone. The caller identification flashed the name of his primary regional bank, followed instantly by a text alert from his dispatch manager. The repossession agencies were acting right now. Tow trucks were already rolling into his commercial lot, securing his flatbed trailers, chaining the axles of the heavy-duty rigs he relied upon to project his illusion of wealth. His freight fleet, the entire foundation of his arrogance, was being seized while he stood helpless in a court of law. The Omaha attorney seated next to Derek reached for his leather briefcase. He unlatched the brass clasps, the sharp clicking sounds echoing in the quiet space. He gathered his legal pads, his expensive pens, and his pristine case files, stuffing them unceremoniously into the bag. He snapped the briefcase shut, stood up, and buttoned his suit jacket. He did not offer his clients a reassuring pat on the shoulder. He did not offer to negotiate a surrender. He walked away from the table, distancing himself entirely from a man who was about to trade a civil dispute for a federal indictment. In the gallery, the reality of the judge's referral finally penetrated Joan's practiced facade. She broke. It was not the delicate, glistening sorrow she had displayed on the witness stand. It was a raw, guttural sound, a primal noise of sheer, unadulterated panic. Her hands flew to her face, tearing at her own hair. The 20-acre plot of commercial farmland was gone. The kinship stipends were gone. The pristine social standing she wielded like a weapon was reduced to rubble. Calvin did not move to comfort her. He remained frozen, staring into the middle distance, calculating the catastrophic weight of the legal fees and the impending criminal defense. I looked at the people who had tried to consume my life. The man who called me a struggling writer was watching his empire vanish in real time on a shattered phone screen. The parents who refused to help me care for a dying child were facing the loss of their freedom. I felt no desire to gloat. I did not stand up and shout in triumph. The victory did not require a theatrical display. The satisfaction lived in the quiet, undeniable truth of the ink printed on the pages resting in front of me. I reached out my fingers, brushing the edge of the thick plastic cover. I pressed the metal rings together, securing the donation logs, the voided contracts, and the forged conservatorship safely inside the plastic sleeves. I closed the heavy crimson binder. The sharp snap of the casing was the final punctuation mark on their hostile takeover. The trap had worked with flawless, brutal precision. I slid the portfolio into my leather bag, ready to walk out of the suffocating air of the courthouse and step into the cold, clean promise of a Nebraska sunrise. The Nebraska wind battered the windows of the farmhouse, but inside, the air was warm and smelled faintly of brewing coffee. It had been 7 days since the gavel fell in Judge Carter's courtroom. 7 days since the carefully constructed fortress of lies my parents and my ex-husband had built was reduced to ash and public record. I stood at the kitchen sink, washing a small plastic cereal bowl, watching the morning sun break over the frost-covered plains. The horizon was painted in brilliant strokes of gold and pale indigo, a sharp, beautiful contrast to the sterile, fluorescent lights of the courthouse. Upstairs, the heavy, rhythmic thud of small footsteps echoed through the ceiling. Toby and Mia were awake, their voices rising in a muffled argument over a shared toy. It was the sound of ordinary chaos, the beautiful, chaotic rhythm of a childhood that was no longer under siege. I dried my hands on a dish towel and picked up my coffee mug. I walked into the living room, the space devoid of the crushing silence that had haunted it a week ago. On the coffee table, spread out with deliberate precision, lay the morning edition of the county newspaper. The headline above the fold was set in bold, unforgiving black type. Local couple under federal investigation for charity fraud. Former logistics CEO faces perjury forgery charges. The article, written by a local reporter who had undoubtedly pulled the public court transcripts, detailed the spectacular collapse of Joan and Calvin Hayes. It documented the $85,000 siphoned from the Community Goodwill Fund. It outlined the purchase of the commercial farmland under a shell corporation. And in a smaller, devastating sidebar, it summarized the forensic analysis of a sapphire blue ink signature that had doomed a prominent local freight operator. The poetic justice of the situation was absolute unfolding with the cold, mechanical precision of a well-executed audit. 2 days after the hearing, the State Attorney General's office initiated the asset forfeiture protocols. The 20-acre plot of prime agricultural land purchased with the price of my son's life was seized by the state. It was currently scheduled for public auction. The proceeds, mandated by a federal judge, would be systematically refunded to every single community member who had contributed to the fraudulent GoFundMe campaign. Joan's grand real estate investment was being liquidated to pay back the very people she had swindled. The social standing my mother had spent decades cultivating, the pristine image she wielded like a weapon in grocery store aisles and church pews, was entirely obliterated. She was no longer the sacrificing grandmother. She was a pariah, a cautionary tale whispered about at the local diner. As for Derek, his financial ruin was swift and total. The repossession of his freight fleet, triggered by the forensic evidence Allison filed prior to the hearing, was merely the first domino. The voided contracts and severed credit lines plunged his logistics company into involuntary Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The custom-ordered silver-barreled fountain pen he used to sign the forged conservatorship was now resting in an evidence locker at the district attorney's office, a physical testament to his catastrophic arrogance. I set my coffee mug down on the newspaper, the ceramic rim obscuring the photograph of Derek's impounded trucks. I did not feel vindictive joy. I did not revel in their destruction. The victory was a cold structural fact, not a cause for celebration. It was simply the necessary outcome of protecting my territory. I walked toward the front door, the heavy oak panels that Calvin had pounded against with such entitlement just a week prior. I opened the door, letting the crisp, freezing morning air spill into the foyer. I stepped out onto the porch, pulling my knitted sweater tight across my chest. The Nebraska plains stretched out before me, a vast, dormant ocean of pale gold and brown. The generational agricultural trust established by Derek's father remained secure, locked away in a custodial account designated solely for Toby and Mia. The $4,000 monthly subsidy would accumulate, ensuring their educational and financial stability, shielded completely from the desperation of a bankrupt father and the greed of thieving grandparents. The sound of the front door opening behind me broke the stillness of the morning. Toby and Mia tumbled out onto the porch, their winter coats half-zipped, their boots stomping loudly against the wooden planks. Toby was holding the small die-cast metal freight truck, the paint chipped, the wheels slightly misaligned from years of aggressive play. He looked up at me, his hazel eyes wide and bright. Can we play in the snow, Mom? I looked down at the toy truck in his hand. It was the same truck I had held in my office when I first discovered the charity fraud. It was a symbol of Leo's innocent, uncorrupted worldview, a stark contrast to the corrupt machinery that had tried to consume our family. Yes, I replied, a genuine smile breaking across my face for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. Go ahead. I will be right here. They scrambled down the porch steps, their laughter ringing out sharp and clear in the freezing air, chasing each other toward the edge of the dormant cornfields. I stood on the porch watching them play, my hands tucked into the pockets of my sweater. I was not the struggling writer Derek despised. I was not the fragile, broken daughter Joan pitied. I was a mother who had learned that silence is not submission, and that a meticulously constructed paper trail is far more dangerous than the loudest lies. The crimson binder rested in the bottom drawer of my home office desk, its plastic sleeves securely closed. It had served its purpose. The audit was complete, the accounts were balanced, the ledger was closed. I breathed in the cold, clean promise of the Nebraska morning, the frost stinging my lungs with a sharp, invigorating clarity. The siege was over. The fortress remained standing. And finally, in the quiet aftermath of the storm, we were safe. This story is a powerful exploration of family dynamics, betrayal, and the profound lengths a mother will go to protect her children. The narrative masterfully weaves together themes of grief, financial exploitation, and the ultimate triumph of meticulous preparation over emotional manipulation. At its core, this is a tale about the true definition of family. The protagonist, Gretchen, initially believes her family consists of the people she shares blood with, her parents and her ex-husband. However, when faced with unimaginable tragedy, she discovers that these very people are her greatest adversaries. They weaponize her grief, orchestrating a complex scheme to strip her of her surviving children and seize control of a generational agricultural trust. Gretchen's response to this betrayal is what makes the story so compelling. Instead of succumbing to the hysteria they expect, she channels her technical writing skills into building an impenetrable legal defense. The crimson binder becomes a symbol of her quiet strength and unwavering determination. She meticulously documents every transaction, every forged signature, and every lie, transforming her grief into a weapon of absolute precision. The story also highlights the dangerous illusion of societal perception. Joan Gretchen's mother masterfully manipulates the local community, portraying herself as the sacrificing grandmother while simultaneously embezzling charity funds. The town, eager to believe the narrative of the noble elder, unquestioningly accepts her version of events. It is only when Allison Gretchen's attorney exposes the undeniable paper trail in the courtroom that the facade crumbles, revealing the monstrous truth underneath. The climax of the story is deeply satisfying. Gretchen doesn't need to shout or scream to achieve justice. She simply allows the evidence to speak for itself. Derek's arrogant perjury and Joan's tearful performance are completely dismantled by the cold, hard facts. The moment Derek's phone begins to buzz with notifications of his impending bankruptcy is a perfect example of poetic justice, a fitting end for a man who tried to steal his children's future to save his own failing enterprise. In the end, Gretchen emerges not just as a survivor, but as an apex predator in the bureaucratic ecosystem she has navigated so skillfully. She reclaims her narrative, secures her children's future, and redefines the meaning of family. The story concludes with a powerful message. True family isn't defined by blood, but by those who stand with you in the storm. It is a stark reminder that while the truth may be heavy, it is the only thing that can truly hold you up when everything else falls away. For more compelling narratives that explore the complexities of family and human nature, Be sure to follow Amanda Told Stories. In a world where loyalty is often assumed, but rarely proven, we must ask ourselves, what are we willing to build to protect the ones we love? Perhaps the greatest defense is not a raised voice, but a quiet, meticulously constructed truth.